it's one thing to be very adept at working with elevation data. It's a whole other ballgame to become very proficient at downloading and making digital elevation models work the way that you want them to. The things that we're used to dealing with elevation models are the resolution and extent, cell size, where the raster cell is mapping. This includes the north, south, east, west coordinates of the data and the units that come from the spatial reference or coordinate system. The pixel values is the range of raster values that you see in the content pane, and usually comes with calculated statistics like min, max, mean, and standard deviation. File size with rasters is determined by the resolution and the overall extent of the data. But in this very brief set of slides, I'd like to talk through some of the more nuanced details of rasters. And that's bands, and if you've worked with remote sensing data at all, you're already familiar with bands and rasters. The pixel type or depth, the source material, which is very important, and most of all, the accuracy. Accuracy of rasters is a very different idea than the resolution. Resolution, the cell size, controls the precision of the data, but data can be very precise and very incorrect. And that's what we're going to talk about in this set of slides. Okay, so for source data for rasters, elevation data, I usually recommend people go directly to the USGS national map. The TNM download app at the USGS, that's what this stands for, is an interactive map where you can choose elevation data, hydrography data, a lot of different types of data. They've got LiDAR, 10 meter, 30 meter, 90 meter data. The other place for those of us in Utah is the mapping portal, formerly called the AGRC and now the Utah Geospatial Resource Center. They've got a whole page of elevation and terrain data, which includes packaged data from the USGS that's already been projected, a selection of Utah LiDAR data, and some special stereoscopic data that was created in 2006, and we'll talk about that. OpenTopography.org is a website research that's been funded by the National Science Foundation. That data is required to be posted here as an open source resource for people. OpenTopography.org for high resolution topography LiDAR data. So digging into the raster properties, we're very used to looking at the source tab, and I want to deconstruct some of the very complex looking file names of this data. This is what the data that you download from the USGS national map will look like. That's what this is. The 13 stands for a 1/3 arc second. I'm going to explain that in just a second. The N39, W110, this is the coordinate, lat-long coordinate of the northwest corner of the raster tile, the upper left. So 39 degrees north, 110 degrees west in either North American datum of 1983 or WGS 84, very similar. And then 2021 is the year 1215. This is the publication date for this tile. So it's actually a great way of storing a lot of information about a raster right in the file name. Now you guys all know that when you're running tools, you're often limited to 13 characters, and so this often doesn't fly. But there you have it. So that's in the data source information. For the raster information, this is what I want to start getting into. First, I want to talk about the cell size. And you might glance at this and think that this is a 10 meter DEM, but if you look closely, this is a very small number, and that's because this is in a geographic coordinate system from the USGS. Recognize when you see such a small number that this is a geographic coordinate system, and the units on this are degrees. So when we talk about resolution, we always talk about resolution in one dimension. We talk about resolution as a length, not an area, and that's just kind of an industry standard so that we don't get confused talking to each other. And then getting back to that 1/3 arc second, that's about a 10 meter DEM. That's what that's describing, because a degree is made up of 60 minutes, and each minute is made up of 60 seconds. A second is about 1/60th of a nautical mile, which is about 31 meters at the equator. And we say at the equator because lines of longitude start narrowing as we approach the poles. So 1/3 arc second is about a 10 meter DEM. Bands, your classic elevation, slope, wind speed, precipitation, those are rasters that contain one value for every cell. It's a one-band raster. Black and white images are also a one-band raster because it's just a shade of gray that we're talking about. But color images will have 3 bands, one band for red, green, and blue in the properties. But going back to the raster information, pixel type and depth is describing the range of values that a cell can hold. It's really common to see 32-bit floating point pixel depths and types because computers have gotten so fast, we can store a lot of data. This means it can hold just about any number ever. You will still encounter data rasters that were set up with smaller or shallower bit depths. But what they mean by type is whether it's signed or unsigned or floating point. And if you look here, you'll see the different, like a signed 8-bit means it can hold anywhere from -128 to 127. Signed means it can hold negative and positive values, but it cuts the total in half, you can see. And then floating point means it can hold fractions. Okay, source material. This is where it starts getting really interesting this week. You guys have heard about LiDAR. Obviously, you've worked with LiDAR. This is awesome data. The USGS, the 3D elevation products from the USGS, is also very good data. But I'm going to talk about the original sourcing and the legacy source material for these kind of seamless data sets. And then in Utah, we have access to the stereoscopic ortho images. They're referred to as autocorrelated DEMs. And we're going to talk about those in a second, but just graphically, I want to plant the seed that those are really suspect rasters. So just very briefly, so we're all on the same page, LiDAR is an exciting technology because we're able to gather points on the ground at lightning speed, literally. A LiDAR sensor measures the time from the pulse send out to the return, and that time allows us to calculate distance. Distance equals time times the speed of light divided by 2, because it's a two-way travel. The platform, whether it's an airplane or a satellite or a drone or we have terrestrial LiDAR where you can just scan, buildings or bluff faces. Those platforms are all equipped with a very high resolution GPS that can account for pitch, yaw, roll, and other types of movement, so that a coordinate pair can be assigned to every single pulse. But we're talking about millions of pulses, and that's what's so exciting about it, because you end up with this cloud of points. The standard data that we've worked with up until very recently was always 10 meter, and this is just an example of the Twitchell Canyon, where we took a 10 meter DEM and calculated the valley bottom and channel from the classic 10 meter DEM from the USGS. This is what the surface looks like post-fire. If we were to use this valley bottom or center line that we've derived from the 10 meter DEM with LiDAR, you can see that we would be creating a lot of error. The 10 meter surface is unable to detect the abrupt valley edges, misrepresents where the flood channel is. You can see here that from the 10 meter DEM, it's actually riding up over the bases of some of these slopes. So my reason for bringing this up is you need to be very curious about the lineage of your data. Where did it come from? What scale was it produced at? and make sure that you're always proceeding with the lowest common denominator for data precision, and making sure that you're using apples with apples and oranges with oranges. So those millions of points that I mentioned that are being shot when we're collecting LiDAR can be post-processed to create something called a first return hillshade. These are also called DSMs, or surface models, because it's the actual surface that the sensor is picking up. It picks up trees, buildings, cars, tops of people's heads. I've never been here. This is in Salt Lake City, so I'm not sure if this is a fence or if it's a power line. Here's the same data set, but cleaned, and these are called last return hillshades, or ground models. But when you think about what has to be cleaned from a data set like this, for example, bridges would act like that wire or that fence and would create an obstacle, so that if we were trying to model flow on the landscape, it would act like a dam and water would artificially pond behind it. So bridges need to be removed. Okay, so pulling data from the USGS, like I said, it's an interactive map, produces great data. The stereoscopic elevations that I was talking about, we use these a lot. Satellites, what I mean by stereoscopic is take images of the ground from two different angles, and from those angles we can use geometry to calculate elevations of the surface. Like I said, they're called autocorrelated DEMs because of the autocorrelation process, spatial autocorrelation to create a smooth surface. The problem with the stuff that's available at the Utah Mapping Portal is that the images that were used, the stereoscopic images that were used, were flown in the summertime, which means vegetation was at its peak, and a lot of times the ground was obscured. And so what you're going to see in that case is some places where the terrain looks very clear and logistically, acceptable, and then other places where it looks like pooled mercury, and you can tell that it's just been kind of glossed over. And those are places of thick vegetation where the ground couldn't be detected, and the surface was sort of just interpolated and guessed at. So that's the data from the mapping portal in Utah for these autocorrelated DEMs comes with a great big warning, and you should take that very seriously. Which brings me to the idea of standards, data standards. What you want to be looking for when you go to the metadata files for these data sets is the NSSDA vertical and horizontal accuracy. The accuracy means it's the ground distance at a 95% confidence level, and it's based on root mean square errors of measured or mapped locations relative to an independent source of higher accuracy for the same location. So 95% confidence level, and then we'll get into that a little bit deeper. So it doesn't matter what data set you're looking for with raster or elevation data, you're always going to be able to find some kind of quality report that talks about that NSSDA accuracy. The autocorrelated DEMs, like I said, come with a great big warning. Let me see. The autocorrelation process is not as rigorous as other methods of elevation modeling, such as photogrammetry, LiDAR mapping, radar mapping, and therefore end users should be aware that anomalies are expected within the elevation data set. So reading this, you might wonder why on earth you'd ever use it. Well, LiDAR is really expensive to fly. Other than that, we have 10-meter data to work with. And so this is a way of getting 2-meter or 5-meter DEMs, which the resolution is really good. It depends on the end purpose. If you are doing any kind of analysis on the landscape, don't use this data. If you're trying to make a nice looking map and you're looking for topographic detail for visualization purposes, then this is a go-to. But read these, you should get in the habit of looking for the accuracy of your raster data. It helps you understand kind of lowest common denominator for accuracy, and it helps you constrain the precision with which you can report elevations, slopes, distances, etc. The USGS has a quality report that lists the priority for their data sources, or the source material for their elevation data sets. First and foremost, they rely on LiDAR wherever it's available, but most of the legacy source material comes from 10-meter DEMs that are derived from 1 to 24,000 scale cartographic contours and mapped hydrography. Does that sound familiar? What kind of data do we work with or see often that's 1 to 24,000 scale from the USGS? It's the topo maps, right? So this is a classic USGS topo map, and what people, hundreds, an army of people did is sat down with digitizing pucks and manually traced around the contour lines, assigned an elevation to each one, and then interpolated between those polyline surfaces. So, you can imagine that, we've got kind of coarse resolution to start with, add in some human error, and that's the legacy data for most of the 10-meter USGS seamless data, elevation data. But again, where there is LiDAR available, they're updated. And I think so legacy topographic data, this is something that I think that's just important to keep in mind. The standard is that for maps with publication scales larger than 1 to 20,000, no more than 10% of the points tested shall be in error by more than 1/30th of an inch. So what that means is those topo maps, if they are 1 inch equals 24,000 inches on the ground, 1/30th of that is 800 inches, which is like 67 feet. So what they're saying is that 90% of the locations on the map need to be within 67 feet of their true location. So keep that in mind when you're reporting, lengths to the nearest thousandth of a millimeter. Don't do that. It's not right. Okay, so what are the other important things to talk about that help us understand how to work with rasters better? Number one, should you or should you not calculate statistics? Yes, do it. It takes 2 seconds and it just makes better displays, and you are then able to do things like classifying your data. If your data is, if you don't have statistics calculated and you go to classify your data, you'll be prompted to calculate statistics for your data. Here's a link to a great description of both building pyramids and statistics. Building pyramids are basically different levels. They're reduced resolution overviews of the data at different scales. So it improves drawing speed. You should always build pyramids when prompted. And then finally, and not least important, resampling techniques. In the Project Rasters tool, the resampling technique is set as an optional setting, and that's not true. It's not optional. You need to know what your resampling techniques are, and you need to know which ones are appropriate to use with your data. So if you run Hillshade on, and I'm shifting gears just a little bit here, if you run Hillshade on a DEM that is in a geographic coordinate system, you'll be prompted with an alert that lets you know that the Z units, your elevation units, are unidentified or undefined, and it gives you a default factor for the Z of 1. And your Hillshade will calculate and look something like this image at the top. This is the same image down below, the correct Hillshade for this area. So you can see this flat area here is very distorted. You can see the same kind of circular feature down here. So you really can't work with Hillshades that are calculated from a geographic coordinate system. So all the moaning that I do about why do we need projections anymore if ArcPro is so good at doing all their measurements geodesically, it's because rasters need to be projected still. Arc doesn't like to work with cell values that are in degrees, latitude and longitude aren't consistent units of measure because longitude converge at the poles, and rasters really need to be square. So when you are projecting a raster and you're faced with this resampling technique drop down, the default is nearest neighbor, and that's because you do less damage when you resample continuous data like elevation using nearest neighbor than you would if you had categorical data or discrete data like land cover and accidentally used bilinear or cubic. That would be a bigger error. It's still an error, I believe, to resample continuous data using nearest neighbor technique because you end up generating a bunch of artificial stripes on your data set. Oh, that's nice. If you click on the eye, it brings up information about the resampling technique. It says it's optional. It's not. Nearest neighbor is for categorical or discrete data like land cover, soil type, and then bilinear and cubic convolution are best used for continuous data. The linear and cubic, when applied to continuous data, create a nice smooth output for the resample. I do have a whole brief video on resampling techniques and how that works, how you actually transpose one set of cells to a new one. But this is basically repeating what I just said. So nearest neighbor, you don't change the input values of the cells. An 11 going in is an 11 going out, but it can create some artificial hard edges. Bilinear is a weighted distance average of the 4 nearest cell centers, which can cause some smoothing. So the highs get a little bit lower and the lows get a little bit higher. Cubic convolution is a curve that's fit through the 16 nearest input cell centers, but because it's fitting a curve, you can sometimes end up with cell values that are outside of the range of your input cell values, and so you just have to make sure you understand what kind of data you're working with and which one is appropriate. Okay, that's it. Into the weeds with DEM data.